It was a quiet evening in Brooklyn. A family gathered for dinner. A pastor, his wife, their 3 children, a trusted friend. Laughter filled the room. Then, minutes later, silence. By the time the police arrived, 6 people were dead. One man sat among them, calm, unmoving. He didn't run. He didn't resist. He simply waited. He said, "I was never a husband. I was never a father. I was just a fool." Ben Collins was a quiet man, a devoted husband, a faithful church member, the kind of man no one suspected. But the children he raised were never his. The woman he loved had never truly been his wife, and the man he trusted most had taken everything from him. For years, Ben said nothing, until one night, he made sure no one would ever lie to him again. A pastor's betrayal, a quiet man's revenge. Welcome to True Crime IQ. Thank you, my dedicated viewers, for your support. Thank you for subscribing and joining me on this journey as we explore the dark and complex stories that challenge our perceptions of trust, love, and betrayal. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an update on our latest compelling narratives. Stay tuned. Pastor Emmanuel Johnson was a man of presence. When he spoke, people listened. When he prayed, people believed. For over a decade, he stood at the pulpit, guiding his congregation with conviction, delivering sermons that stirred hearts, bringing people to their knees in worship. To his church, he was more than a pastor. He was a shepherd, a mentor, a man chosen by God himself. He led with wisdom. He counseled married couples, urging them to honor their vows. He prayed over struggling families, promising them hope. He built outreach programs, feeding the homeless, caring for the lost. When people looked at Pastor Emmanuel, they saw a man of integrity, a man whose hands were clean, a man whose soul was pure. But in a city as vast as New York, filled with millions of lives crossing paths, temptations rise in places no one expects. And for Pastor Emmanuel, temptation walked into his church one Sunday morning and sat in the front row. Her name was Deborah Adams. She was new to the city, a woman in her late 20s, drawn to the promise of a fresh start. She wasn't like the other women in the congregation. She was striking, confident. She carried herself with a kind of elegance that turned heads. She dressed in a way that made people look twice. And Pastor Emmanuel, he looked. At first, it was harmless. A warm welcome. A friendly conversation after service. A gentle invitation to join the ministry, to become part of the church family. That's all it was. That's all it should have been. But then, something changed. He started noticing her more. Watching as she walked into the sanctuary, the way she smiled, the way she lingered when she spoke to him. He told himself he was guiding her spiritually, helping her find her path, that it was his duty, his calling, to lead her closer to God. But the truth was much simpler. He wanted her. And what Pastor Emmanuel wanted, he took. It started with long conversations after service, late-night phone calls, a quiet understanding that neither of them spoke about, but both of them felt. He would wait for her after prayer meetings. She would find reasons to stay behind. The lines between faith and desire blurred. Then one night, they disappeared entirely. From that moment on, secrecy became part of their routine. They met behind locked doors, away from the eyes of the congregation. They sat together in dimly lit rooms where whispered words meant more than prayers. The pastor preached about loyalty, about devotion, about righteousness, then left the pulpit and lay beside a woman who was never his to claim. People noticed, though they never said it out loud. Whispers grew, exchanged in hushed tones between church members. Eyes followed them, searching for evidence of something unholy beneath the surface. But Pastor Emmanuel was careful. He was respected. Who would dare question a man of God? So the affair continued, unchallenged, unseen, until one day, Pastor Emmanuel made a decision that would set the stage for something no one could have predicted. He gave Deborah to another man, a man who trusted him, a man who had never questioned his guidance, a man who would soon learn that the person he had placed his faith in had been lying to him all along. Ben Collins was a man who never stood out. He was quiet, hardworking, the kind of man who kept his head down, did his job, and went home. He wasn't the life of the party. He wasn't the kind of person people gossiped about. He lived simply, spoke when necessary, and carried himself with quiet discipline. To those around him, he was predictable, steady, a man of faith, a man who believed in order, in honesty, in the power of doing what was right. For years, Ben's life followed a routine. He woke up before sunrise, put on his work uniform, and drove to the auto shop where he spent his days fixing engines, replacing brakes, and getting his hands covered in grease. It was exhausting work, but he never complained. When his shift ended, he washed up, changed his clothes, and made his way to Bethlehem Grace Ministries, where he sat in the same seat every Sunday, nodding along to Pastor Emmanuel's sermons, taking in every word. Faith was his foundation. He trusted in it. He relied on it. And in his heart, he believed that if he followed the path set before him, if he lived honorably, God would reward him. And for Ben, there was only one thing missing: a wife, a partner, someone to build a life with. But in a city as vast as New York, finding the right person was not easy. He had seen the way relationships fell apart, the way people rushed into love only to be torn apart by betrayal and disappointment. Ben didn't want that. He wanted something real, something solid, a marriage that would last a lifetime, a union built on faith. He wanted the kind of love Pastor Emmanuel always preached about. So one evening, after a church service, Ben made his way to the pastor's office. He sat across from the man he had looked up to for years, the man who had guided him, counseled him, and helped him grow in his faith. And he told him the truth. "Pastor, I think I'm ready to settle down, to find a wife. But I don't know how to find the right one." It was a simple request, a plea for guidance. And in that moment, Pastor Emmanuel didn't hesitate. He smiled, leaned forward, and spoke with certainty. "Ben, God has already chosen someone for you. I see her in the congregation, a good woman, a woman of faith." Ben listened, hanging on to every word. He trusted Pastor Emmanuel, believed in his wisdom. If the pastor had received a vision from God, if he had been led to guide Ben toward the woman who was meant for him, who was he to question it? And then, Pastor Emmanuel spoke her name. Deborah Adams, a woman of faith. That's how he described her. A devoted member of the church, a kind soul, someone who, like Ben, was searching for something deeper, something meaningful. And in that moment, Ben believed that his prayers had been answered. Days later, he met her properly. They spoke. They laughed. He felt comfortable with her. He saw the way she smiled at him, the way she listened when he spoke. There was no reason to doubt, no reason to hesitate. If Pastor Emmanuel said she was the right one, she must be. Within months, the wedding was arranged. It was a beautiful ceremony. The congregation gathered, the choir sang, and at the front of the church, Pastor Emmanuel stood between them, blessing their union. He spoke about love, about trust, about the sacred bond between husband and wife. Ben held Deborah's hands, looked into her eyes, and vowed to be faithful to her for the rest of his life. He had no idea that the man standing between them had already broken those vows before they were ever spoken. He had no idea that the woman he was pledging his life to had already pledged herself to someone else. And he had no idea that the children he would one day call his own would never truly belong to him. Years passed. Life moved forward. To anyone looking in from the outside, Ben Collins had everything he had ever wanted. A wife, a home, 3 beautiful children, 2 boys and a girl. A family built on faith, on devotion, on trust. But something was wrong. At first, it was subtle. Little things. Things a husband might ignore. A glance that lingered too long. A soft smile that faded too quickly. A quiet tension in the air, gone before he could put a name to it. Deborah had always been independent, always carried herself with confidence. But now, there was something else. A distance. A restlessness. A way she moved through their home as if she were there and somewhere else at the same time. She became distracted, preoccupied. Her phone, once left on the kitchen counter or beside her on the couch, was now always in her hand. Always locked. Always close. Late at night, when Ben lay beside her, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing, a faint glow would illuminate the darkness. The soft sound of fingers tapping against a screen. A quiet, secret conversation unfolding in the shadows. She spoke about church meetings that ran late. Prayer groups that lasted for hours. She came home with a tired smile, kissed the children goodnight, climbed into bed beside her husband, and slept soundly. But Ben was no longer sure if the woman lying next to him was the same woman he had married. He told himself not to think too much of it. That doubt was dangerous. That suspicion had no place in a marriage built on trust. that the woman who had stood before God and vowed to be his wife was faithful, devoted, honest. But the questions stayed with him, and the more he tried to ignore them, the louder they became. Neighbors noticed the change. The way Ben, once steady, once predictable, now seemed distracted. The way he lingered outside before stepping into his home, as if he were preparing himself for what waited inside. He was quiet, but you could tell something was wrong. Ben didn't talk about it. He didn't ask questions. He didn't accuse. He simply watched. He paid attention. And in time, the truth revealed itself. One night, while Deborah was in the shower, her phone lit up on the nightstand. A message. A name. Ben stared at the screen, his heart pounding in his chest, his hands suddenly cold. He reached for the phone, hesitated, then picked it up. The message was short, intimate. A whisper in the dark from someone who should have never been whispering to his wife. I miss you. Can't wait to see you tonight. The name above the message made his stomach turn. Pastor Emmanuel. Ben felt the world shift beneath him. His hands tightened around the phone, his breath slow, controlled. He scrolled up, past weeks, months, of messages. Plans made in secret. Words meant for someone else. Love confessed in a way that had never been meant for him. The woman he had trusted. The pastor he had followed. The two people who had stood beside him, who had told him that his marriage was blessed, that it had been ordained by God himself, had been lying from the very beginning. Ben put the phone back exactly where he had found it. He stood still for a long time, staring at nothing, listening to the sound of running water from the bathroom, the sound of his wife humming softly, unaware that the world she had built was beginning to crack. He said nothing. That night, he kissed his children goodnight. He turned off the lights. He climbed into bed beside Deborah, closed his eyes, and waited for sleep to take him. But sleep never came. The next evening, he followed her. She told him she had a church meeting. He nodded, watched her leave. Then, minutes later, he grabbed his keys, walked outside, got into his car, and drove after her. He stayed back, far enough not to be noticed, close enough to see where she was going. Through the streets of Brooklyn, through the heart of the city, until she reached a hotel near Times Square. She parked, walked inside, didn't hesitate, then pulled over on the opposite side of the street. He sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel, watching the entrance. 10 minutes passed, then 15, then 20, and then another car arrived. It was familiar. A sleek, dark sedan. A car he had seen every Sunday in the church parking lot. A car driven by a man who stood before a congregation and preached about loyalty, about faith, about devotion. Pastor Emmanuel stepped out, straightened his jacket, and walked inside. Ben didn't move. He sat in his car, staring at the entrance, watching the door slowly close behind the man he had once trusted above all others. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't even feel anger. There was only silence. Cold. Absolute. Unshaken. He sat there for a long time, watching the entrance, waiting for something, anything, to make this moment feel real. But nothing changed. Nothing happened. Just time passing, just cars moving, just people walking by, unaware that a life had just been ripped apart without a single word being spoken. Ben took a slow breath, exhaled. Then, without saying a word, he turned the key in the ignition, pulled away from the curb, and drove home. He had seen enough. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful, the kind that lingers in the air like something waiting to be broken. Ben sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, his fingers tapping slowly against the wood. Across from him, Deborah stood, shifting on her feet, a hesitant smile on her lips. There was a glow in her face, the kind of happiness that should have been contagious. But Ben felt nothing. I'm pregnant, she said. The words should have meant something. They should have brought joy, excitement, anticipation. But all Ben felt was the slow, creeping weight of doubt pressing against his chest. He nodded, forced to smile, said all the right words. But deep inside, something was unraveling. The night outside that hotel, the messages on her phone, the way Pastor Emmanuel looked at her, spoke to her, stood beside her like he belonged there. It all came rushing back, crashing into him in a way he could no longer ignore. Ben knew. He had known for a long time. But knowing wasn't enough anymore. Ben handed over the samples, nodded when they told him it would take a few days, and walked out the door without looking back. And then, he waited. 3 days passed. 3 days of normalcy. 3 days of pretending. He kissed Deborah on the cheek, played with his children, went to work, went to church, sat in the same pew, listened to the same sermons, looked at Pastor Emmanuel standing at the pulpit and wondered how long the man had been lying to him, how long he had been smiling in his face, shaking his hand, calling him brother. When the results arrived, Ben opened the envelope slowly, carefully, as if rushing would somehow change what was inside. He unfolded the papers, his hands steady, his breath even. He read the words once, twice, 3 times. Probability of paternity, 0%. He stared at the page, waiting for the numbers to change, for the ink to rearrange itself into something else, something that made sense. But the words remained the same. The truth, printed in black and white. He flipped to the next page. Another result. Another number. Probability of paternity, 0%. His heartbeat didn't quicken. His hands didn't shake. His breath didn't hitch. He turned to the last page, slowly, methodically, already knowing what it would say but needing to see it anyway. Probability of paternity, 0%. 3 children. 3 names. 3 lives he had devoted himself to, and not one of them was his. Ben exhaled, long and slow, and set the papers down on the table. The room around him felt different now, smaller, suffocating. The air too thick, the walls too close. The house he had built, the family he had cherished, the life he had poured himself into. It was all a lie, a carefully crafted illusion, a cruel joke that only he hadn't been in on. He sat there for a long time, unmoving. The clock on the wall ticked forward, marking the minutes, the hours. Outside, the city moved on, people going about their lives, unaware that, in this small, quiet house in Brooklyn, a man was coming to terms with the fact that everything he had ever known was gone. Later that evening, he watched his children play. The sound of their laughter filled the room, bouncing off the walls, wrapping around him like something distant, something unreachable. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He only watched. They were his in every way that mattered, but they were never truly his at all. Deborah moved through the house as if nothing had changed. She set the table, hummed a tune, called for the children to wash their hands before dinner. She sat beside him, touched his arm, smiled at him like she had done 1,000 times before. And for the first time, Ben realized how effortlessly she could lie. How easy it was for her to exist in this world she had built on deception. How comfortable she was inside the ruins of a marriage that had never really existed. Ben did not speak of the test, did not ask her why, did not demand explanations he already knew she would twist into something meaningless. There was nothing left to say. The truth was already written, sealed in an envelope, marked in numbers that could never be undone. The family he had spent years protecting had never been his to protect. The children he had sworn to raise had never belonged to him. And the man he had trusted more than anyone had taken everything from him. Ben did not rage. He did not scream. He did not break the silence that had settled so deeply inside him. He only sat there, listening to the voices around him, watching the world move forward, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. The decision was made long before he ever stepped foot in the store, long before he reached for the item on the shelf, long before he counted out the bills, took his receipt, and walked back to his car without a single moment of hesitation. The moment he read those test results, the moment he sat across from his wife and realized she would never tell him the truth, Ben Collins knew exactly what he was going to do. It was never a question of if, only when. The store was small, tucked between a laundromat and a deli on a quiet street in Queens. A place that didn't ask questions. A place where people bought things they didn't want to explain. He walked in, scanned the aisles, let his eyes land on the section he was looking for. Small, unassuming, easily overlooked. Rodent control. The box sat among the others, no different from the rest. A simple label. Instructions printed neatly on the back. Colorless, tasteless, easy to mix. A product designed for pest control. A product that, in the wrong hands, became something else entirely. He picked it up, turned it over, read the words carefully. He placed it in his cart, walked to the register, handed over a few crumpled bills, and walked out. The entire process took less than 5 minutes. 5 minutes to turn a quiet man into something unrecognizable. 5 minutes to rewrite the course of 6 lives forever. The box sat in the glove compartment of his car for days. untouched, unopened, not because he was having second thoughts, but because he was waiting, because patience was something Ben Collins understood better than most. And when the moment presented itself, he was ready. The invitation came from Deborah, a family dinner at Pastor Emmanuel's home. Nothing out of the ordinary, a gathering they had been to before, an evening of conversation, laughter, food, a chance to sit at the table, to break bread, to look a man in the eyes and pretend nothing had changed. Ben accepted without hesitation. The night of the dinner, he arrived exactly on time. Not early, not late, just as he always did. The house was warm, filled with the scent of home-cooked food, the sound of children's laughter, the quiet hum of life continuing as if nothing was wrong. He smiled, shook hands, embraced the man who had taken everything from him, kissed the woman who had lied to him for years. And then, when the moment was right, he excused himself to the kitchen. The tea was already on the stove, steeping, the aroma filling the air. It was part of the routine, a tradition after every family meal. A cup of warmth, a simple pleasure. The final step of the evening before goodbyes were exchanged and everyone went home. Ben poured the cups carefully, steady hands, slow movements. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small packet, and tore it open. The powder disappeared into the liquid without a trace. No smell, no taste, no sign of what was waiting in the cups now resting on the tray. He carried them back to the dining table, placed them gently in front of each person, settled into his seat, and picked up his own cup. He brought it to his lips, let the warmth touch his mouth, but did not drink. They talked as they sipped, unaware. Deborah beside him, Pastor Emmanuel across from him, his wife, his children, the people who had created his world, the people who had destroyed it. He watched them, listened to them, memorized the sound of their voices, the way their laughter filled the room. And then, slowly, one by one, the laughter stopped. A cough, a pause, a hand gripping a throat, a chair scraping against the floor. The first gasp of air that wouldn't come. The first sign that something was wrong. Confusion turned to panic. Hands clutched at chests, at throats, at anything that could stop the tightening, the burning, the feeling of something taking hold inside them and refusing to let go. Eyes widened, searching for answers, for help, for a reason why their bodies were betraying them all at once. And through it all, Ben sat still, calm, silent. The chaos unfolded around him. Deborah reached for him, fingers digging into his arm, her mouth forming words that never made it past her lips. The children, his children, the ones he had raised but never truly fathered, collapsed against the table, their bodies shaking, their voices crying out in fear. Pastor Emmanuel's wife, gasping, pleading, her hands trembling as she struggled to rise. And finally, the man himself. Pastor Emmanuel locked eyes with him, confusion giving way to realization, realization giving way to horror. Ben leaned forward. His voice was soft, measured, final. You recommended her to me. The pastor's lips parted, as if to speak, as if to explain, as if to beg for something that could never be given. But no words came. His body slumped forward, lifeless, his face falling into the table, into the mess of spilled tea and shattered glass. Silence followed. The kind of silence that does not end. The kind that does not heal. Ben sat back in his chair, looked around the room, took in the stillness. The world had not changed. The city outside moved on, untouched. The streetlights glowed. Cars passed. Life continued. And inside this house, 6 lives had ended. Ben placed his cup down, untouched, and folded his hands in his lap. And then, he waited. The call came in at 9:47 p.m. A disturbance. Possible medical emergency. 6 individuals unconscious. The address was familiar. Pastor Emmanuel's home. A place officers had passed by many times before. A place known for gatherings, for fellowship, for faith. But what they found inside was unlike anything they had ever seen. 6 bodies. Slumped over the table. Motionless. The remnants of a meal still sitting untouched. A shattered teacup on the floor, liquid pooling beneath it. The smell of something faint in the air, something no one could identify at first. And at the center of it all, one man. Ben Collins. He didn't run. He didn't scream. He didn't plead. He just sat there, hands folded neatly in his lap, his face blank, his breathing steady. He looked at the officers as they entered, their voices raised, their weapons drawn, their footsteps hurried as they moved to check for signs of life. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He just sat there, waiting for us. They ordered him to stand. He did. They placed him in cuffs. He didn't resist. They asked him what had happened. He gave them no answer. He walked out of the house, past the flashing lights, past the gathering crowd, past the world that had no idea what had just taken place. He didn't look back. At the precinct, he was placed in an interrogation room. They asked him why. They told him he had a chance to explain, to offer something, anything, that would make sense of what he had done. Hours passed. Officers came and went. Lawyers whispered outside the door. And Ben sat in silence. Then, finally, he spoke. I was never a husband. I was never a father. I was just a fool. The trial was quick. There was no spectacle, no drawn-out battle between defense and prosecution, no plea for leniency, no argument for temporary insanity, no attempt to justify, to shift blame, to lessen the weight of what had been done. Ben Collins pleaded guilty to all charges. The courtroom was silent when the judge delivered the sentence. Life in prison. No possibility of parole. The finality of it settled over the room like a weight no one could shake. Deborah's family wept. Members of the congregation sat in stunned silence, still grappling with the truth. The man they had trusted. The woman they had admired. The pastor they had followed. All gone. Ben showed no reaction. No regret. No satisfaction. He stood, accepted his fate, and was led away in handcuffs, disappearing through the doors of the courtroom without a single glance back. The church closed its doors soon after. The pulpit that once held Pastor Emmanuel's voice now stood empty. The seats that once held worshipers now gathered dust. The place that had once been filled with faith, with music, with prayer, now held only silence. As we reflect on this tragedy, we're left with the question, was this justice? Or was it simply another tragedy? What do you think? Was Ben justified in his revenge? Or did he go too far? We want to hear from you. Share your thoughts on this case in the comments below. Was justice served? If you found this story compelling, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We have many more gripping stories just like this one. Stay tuned for more, and thank you for watching.